Think we are. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers, sisters, and friends, Jazakallah khairan for joining. Just a quick sanity check. Just want to make sure everything is up and running and it all looks good from my end. So, alhamdulillah, we are actually live. Let's go. Okay, so, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, Mobi. How you doing, man? Right, okay, so today, inshallah, we're covering the second session of epistemology. We're going to be closing that topic today. And today we're going to be speaking more about science, scientism, and also evolution. And basically, what does that mean? So I've titled this one actually, Evolution is a Scientific Fact, which is a statement I'm going to stand behind. But hopefully, inshallah, by the end of today's session, you will understand contextually what does that mean, what does that mean for the dawah, and where we can go with it from there. Do we have to accept it as the reality or not? So let's just go through a very brief recap, because we're going to be building on the exercises excuse me, that we discussed yesterday, or in the previous video if you're watching this later on YouTube. So we're going to be building on these concepts. And a reminder, this is the most difficult aspect of the course. If you're not understanding it, if you're not following it, feel free to stop me, ask me to clarify and explain. If you're watching this being restreamed somewhere, which it might be, I am actually live on twitch.tv/Dawah Power, so you're welcome to come in and ask me live directly there. It is quite fast latency. So let's just go through a very brief recap, just to remind everyone what we discussed, so that we can build on these principles and things like that we discussed today. So so we basically started off with the tree of knowledge, and basically the idea of what we want to do is just cut down the old tree and just replace it with a new tree, rather than just messing around and pruning the branches and whatnot. Sources of knowledge, we went through the whole aspect of what color is my car. What defines proof? Now, this is an important thing. When we come to this discussion as to what proof is, we need to have some kind of an agreement with the person that we're talking to. What exactly do we mean when we're using this term, and what do they mean when they're using this term? Because so long as you have a common understanding now of what you mean when you use proof, then when you can offer them something that conforms to whatever it was that you agreed, they can't just turn around and say that, oh, this is not proof, which is what they can do. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Which is what they can do if you don't have that agreement in place. If you don't have an agreement or a common understanding as to what proof is, what the standard of proof is, then it just leaves the people open to just dismiss anything and everything, because that agreement actually hasn't been made. So it's important to get some kind of a common ground agreement as to what you mean by proof. So what I've offered here is basically, when you take evidences, and evidence is an individual bit of evidence, is an individual source of knowledge, as a type of knowledge. So if we go back to the photos of me and trying to determine what the color of my car is, you have the photograph, which is an evidence, which is some kind of knowledge. You also have knowledge of Photoshop being a thing, so that may have been a part. You also know what monster trucks are like and whether they're usable. The road laws are, that monster trucks crush cars, and it's probably unlikely that I'm going to be doing that, how much fuel they use and whatever have you. So you have all of these different bits of evidences, each one that kind of points to a different potential conclusion. So from these evidences, you can draw plausible conclusions. It could be this, it could be that, it could be this, it could be that. So these are the things that, you have possibilities. You narrow it down to the things that are plausible, that it could be this and it could be that. In a given situation, it could have been X, it could have been Y. But when you only have one plausible option, there is only one possible conclusion that you can reach when you look at the evidences, then we can regard this as proof. So proof is what I would offer, and I think should be accepted by anyone that you're discussing with. Proof should basically be when there is no plausible alternative. If there's no plausible alternative, then you've proven your point. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean an alternative doesn't exist. It's just not plausible. It just doesn't make sense. There's no evidence or anything like that to support the contrary. Now, we'll discuss the red herring. So this is basically the example of it, that you have your evidences which give you possibilities. You have the plausible ones, which obviously you need a certain degree of reasoning to determine whether it's plausible or not. And then proof is when you only have one of these. So the example we went through was Fulan born to a virgin mother. The evidences that we had was this happened in the 1800s. This is a hypothetical example, obviously. It happened in the 1800s, that the child shares the mother's features and the mother is married with older children. So of all of the possibilities that, the child was born of a natural relationship, artificial insemination, blah, 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 the only plausible one, given that it's in the 1800s, so being in the 1800s, it eliminates artificial insemination and surrogacy because it wasn't possible then. The stork, we eliminate that just from rationale because we know it's a story. Similar with a miracle, again, there's no evidence for that. Adoption is also ruled out because of the child sharing the mother's features, and also we affirm the natural relationship because the mother's married, so we can assume that there's obviously a natural relationship there, because who gets married without at least considering or intending to have that relationship? And she has older children as well. So the only one plausible explanation for the mechanism of that child being born is a natural relationship, and therefore, because it's the only plausible explanation, there we can prove from this situation that the mother cannot have been a virgin in this regard. So this is just a quick recap of what we did yesterday, and then we went through the methodology of argumentation, which we went into a lot of depth in that yesterday. The point here is that I want to remind you guys of, again, is the claiming ignorance aspect. So just because somebody claims ignorance doesn't mean that, just because they say, oh, well, we don't know what the alternative is, doesn't mean that there has to be an alternative. Okay? So you can't live in a state where you're always claiming ignorance to another possibility just because you want to escape what the conclusion is drawing you towards. Does that make sense? Because at the end of the day, we have to live in the here and now. We have to drink, we have to eat, otherwise we'll survive. We can't abstain from these and say, well, I don't know if the food might get lodged in my throat and I might suffocate, I might die, or whatever have you. We don't live like that. We live in the here and now. Yes, we consider these as possibilities, but we also weigh them up, in real world reasonable ways. Unfortunately, it just seems that reason just goes straight out of the window as soon as you consider topics that fundamentally could change a person's life, which is, who are we, where did we come from, what is our purpose, and where are we going? Okay, so, and then we discussed how do you arrive towards conclusions, and we basically discussed the difference between the process of induction and deduction. And again, induction is when you take a set of empirical data that you can observe, you can measure yourself, and you try to extrapolate and predict what the next result will be. But because it involves a certain degree of prediction, there is always that gap, that possibility that whatever you predict could actually be wrong. So it can never give you 100% certainty, whereas deduction actually can, because you start off from the whole total range of possibilities. Obviously, if you formulated your deductive argument correctly, you start off with the whole range of possibilities, and then you eliminate that which is not possible, implausible, and if you're only left with a singular solution, then by definition that has to be the truth. And again, from a logical perspective, and this is what deduction is based on, it's logical rather than it's based on real world exercise. From a logical perspective, that will always work. If there's ever a mistake in a deductive outcome, that's usually from human error, because you haven't considered all of the possibilities in the first place, or maybe you discarded something as being implausible when it actually wasn't. So the process itself is fine. It's usually down to human error as to why and where any mistake, if any, would come in. So again, induction is based on the scientific process, whereas deduction is a logical process. And it's important to remember that science relies upon logic. Logic doesn't rely upon science. Science relies upon logic, because to make a scientific conclusion or to determination, whatever have you, you have to have some degree of logical reasoning ability as well, in terms of when you're looking at your data and whatnot. So that being said, very, very quick recap going into it. Let's have a look at what science and scientism is. Bismillah. Okay. So, science, as we discussed, is based on induction. Okay? Now, science is only concerned with how to explain how the natural world works via physical processes. And what do I mean by natural world? What do I mean by nature? I mean something that is physical, something that is tangible, something that you can touch, something that you can hold, something that you can measure. Okay? If you're unable to measure it in any empirical way, like in a numerical way, then from a scientific perspective, it doesn't exist. Okay, so the example there. So for example, we love our mothers, right? But can that be measured in any empirical way? Can you put a number on it? No, because it's not the type of. I mean, we know, we as human beings, we experience it, and we know it's there, and we can evaluate the strength of, we love some people more than we love other people. So there is definitely a way that we can measure it. But can we measure it empirically? Can we put a number on it? Absolutely not. This is not some kind of empirical data. So from a scientific perspective, because science can't look at it, it falls outside of the realm of science, and from a scientific perspective, it doesn't exist. Okay. Now let me make this point clear. From a scientific perspective, it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that science is claiming it doesn't exist. Okay, there's a difference. Remember how we said it's impossible to prove a negative. It's not a scientific assertion to say that there is no such thing as love. Okay. What we just mean is that science is blind to it. It falls outside of anything that you can do from a scientific perspective. Remember, all science is just a methodology of how do we arrive towards truth and conclusions based on measuring real world things. And we can't measure love. So from a scientific perspective, it doesn't exist. It's like, as we have the example there, discussing what blue tastes like. Like, just because that sentence, that query makes sense, doesn't make sense, just because from a grammatical perspective that we can understand the sentence, what does blue taste like? We can understand the sentence, we understand what the sentence is trying to get at, doesn't mean that it actually has any real world value. Okay, it's a nonsensical position. Sentence-wise, grammatically, is completely correct. We understand what's being sensed, but it makes absolutely no sense to discuss it. Does that make sense? So, because again, the taste of what blue is, or the shape of love, or these things are outside of the characteristics of those things. Blue is just a color. It's a wavelength being emitted. It doesn't have a taste, and love is an emotion. It's a bond. It's a feeling that you have. It doesn't have a physical shape. It's a non-physical thing, so you can't ascribe physical shapes to it. It makes no sense. So again, from a scientific perspective, anything that is outside of the natural world, that is outside of nature, that cannot be empirically measured, from a scientific perspective, it's just ignored. It doesn't exist. It's not on its radar. Okay, and again, this is different from asserting it doesn't exist. It just, from a scientific perspective, they cannot see it. So so here's a question. Given that, and given the basic definition of any God, I want to say any God, I mean anyone's basic definition of God would be something supernatural, does it now make sense for science to have an opinion on God, or to make any kind of an assertion about God? What do you guys think? What do you guys think? Because again, we've limited science to only something that is natural. God, by definition, is supernatural, beyond nature. So of course, it makes no sense from a scientific perspective, to be talking about God. Okay, and I want to make that one exactly, and I want to make that one very, very clear. So anytime you hear anything or anyone talking, from a scientific perspective about God, remember, straight away, they're already stepping out of their remit, because they're talking about something supernatural by definition from the perspective of nature, which is a dumb position to start off with. That said, I actually, from a scientific perspective, it is possible to prove it through logic, but you can't prove it through science alone. You have to resort through to logical proofs, which we'll come to in future sessions, inshallah. But I'm sure my cat is crying here. I don't know. She's probably locked herself out somewhere. Right. Lost my train of thought now. Bismillah. Right. So it makes absolutely no sense in that regard. Okay. Let me give you another example as well, because I've got it here on the slide. So let me just expand on that. So consider an example of water boiling in a kettle. So I've invited you over to my place, and we're going to have some tea. Okay, we're not going to have coffee because I don't like coffee. We're going to have tea. So I put the kettle on. Okay, now is it possible to examine that kettle and determine why exactly was it turned on? Or what? Sorry, let me ask the question another way. Is it possible to determine why the water's boiling? Right? And there's a yes answer and there's a no answer. And it's important that we understand the distinction between the two. Okay? So, yes, we can determine why the water is boiling, because the kettle is turned on, because electricity throwing through the wiring through the coils is basically heating up the water through thermal induction, raising the water temperature to the atmospheric pressure, which is causing the water to boil, and that's how basically the water boils. Okay, so that is a scientific explanation as to why the water is boiling. But can you answer the question the other way, like why is the water boiling? Why is the kettle turned on? The answer being was because we want a cup of tea. And the answer is you can't. It's impossible to examine the kettle and to work out the intent as to why the person put it on, because that intent is not measurable. There's no physical evidence of it, which means from a scientific perspective, it's nonsensical to even begin to look at that and to understand what the intent is. Isn't explaining how the water... Yeah, the problem is, in the language, okay, it's a good question, but in the language, the how and why are often used interchangeably in this kind of context. Okay, so but yes, you are correct. It is more of it can be made into a semantic point, but some people don't really get bogged down occasionally in the semantics of it. They'll just mean the same thing. And the problem is, oftentimes as well, when you're trying to explain something, you're trying to ask something of someone, they'll just describe a process rather than describing the intent behind a process as well. It's a generic, it's a wider general point, but yes, how the water is boiling. Because you could also say, well, how the water is boiling was because, obviously you initiated some action to begin with because you wanted tea. But what I wanted the takeaway from this is that there is two different things going on. There's a physical world processes that you can measure and determine and explain as to why the water is coming to boil. But there's also the intention that is unmeasurable, that you can never determine just by looking at the kettle alone. Okay, now, so given that that is the basis of what science and scientism is, obviously we need to consider its limitations, which is that it's limited by empirical data that's gathered by sensory perception. So if you can't sense it, and it doesn't have to be your own senses, we can build tools and instruments that can measure it. But the point is, unless we can perceive that measurement, we're not going to know that information. Okay. And this leads to fun also contradictions as well. So, for example, you can have some people who are very, very strict empiricists, right? That would deny that, and I know to a rational, reasonable person, it makes no sense. But hey ho, you get these kind of people, right? That when they if they were to see a white cat go out in a snowstorm, because they cannot discern the difference between the white cat and the snow anymore, they would say that the white cat is not there, basically. Ridiculous position to hold. I mean, but if you want to be really, really strict about it in a scientific perspective, from a scientific perspective, yeah, that's true. I suppose from an empirical perspective, yes, it's true, because you can't measure the cat being there. So that if you can't measure the cat being there, the cat is not there. But from a completely different perspective, and this is where we have to make our worldview more holistic. You just know from logic, well, the cat was there and it didn't obviously disappear, so it must still be there. Does that make sense? Right. Let's have a look at the other example, which is that your great 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 grandfather. Now consider, we all each of us have a father, and we have two grandfathers, which is our father's father and our mother's father. So we have 4 great grandfathers. We have 8 great great grandfathers. Being able to explain the mechanism doesn't explain that it doesn't negate that there isn't an agent there before the mechanism. Absolutely, absolutely. Exactly, that's a good way to put it. So we have 8 great great grandfathers, and it doubles every single time. So once you get to this level, you could have 512, over 1,000 great 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 great, however many it is, grandfathers, right? Over 1,000 of them. Now, can you prove scientifically that this person was not a virgin? And here's the point: scientifically, can you prove it? Right? Now, obviously, a rational person would say, well, straight away, because, well, yes, you can prove that that person existed and was not a virgin, because by definition, you exist here now. Because if that person did not father a child, then you would not exist. Your entire your existence is predicated on every single one of your ancestors procreating. That makes sense, right? We cannot have someone in our ancestry who did not engage in procreation, otherwise we wouldn't exist. So they would say, well, this is the evidence, right? To which I would respond, well, yes, but that's a logical evidence. That's purely logical based, because we know the mechanics and we know that X necessitates Y, and therefore we can come to a conclusion based on logic alone. But I'm asking you for something scientific, something that is based on empirical data, right? Understand the distinction here now. So what I'm asking you is, I want you to find this person's grave, or wherever they are, wherever the remains are, even if you find them. Well, can you do a DNA test? I'm not sure you can do a DNA test, because don't forget, if this person is one of 1,000 contributors to your DNA, male contributors, you'll also have 1,000 odd female contributors, which means he is 1/2,000th of the contributors of your of DNA to you, which is, just to be able to work out his contribution alone, that basically puts you down, that's smaller than the margin of error, basically. So you're not going to be able to determine that this person definitely is your ancestor just by DNA alone. That's assuming you even find the grave. And even then, you outside of that, even if you find the grave and somehow work out through records or whatever have you, and somehow prove that these records haven't been falsified, that, okay, fine, this is the skeleton of someone who's supposedly your grandparent, how can you look at a male skeleton and determine that male skeleton was a father? You can't, because there's nothing. Like, maybe you could on a woman. I'm not a biologist. I don't know if the women's body changes, from giving birth. And even then, even if it did, even if we were considering woman, there's no guarantee that child that was born survived long enough to procreate themselves and therefore become part of your lineage. Do you see the point here now? That if you really just restrict yourself to just looking at empirical data and divorce yourself from looking at logic, then you will lead yourself to very, very skewed results. Okay? Which is why Dr. Zakir Naik used to have this thing that he said, that you wouldn't really understand it at face value, but it makes more sense in this context, which was it science without religion is religion without science is blind, but science without religion is lame, or something like that. There used to be a statement he made, but essentially, like, you can't restrict your view in such a narrow manner and basically cut off other sources of knowledge and yet expect to come to some kind of a conclusion that is going to be sound in the wider perspective. Does that make sense? Like, you can't just say, I'm going to reject all kinds of evidence except that which is empirical, And whatever conclusion I draw from just having this narrow blinkered set, this vision, I'm then going to project that conclusion upon everything, including the stuff that I didn't consider in the first place. Does that make sense? That's a very incorrect methodology to work with, which unfortunately is what a lot of people fall into, which is, the basis on which a lot of people justify their atheism, because of this notion, oh, science and religion can't go together. Where they absolutely can. It's just that people have misunderstood science. So again, we have scientific science here that is limited to present day information as well. So obviously you don't know future events and past events. You can't consider that. You can't consider that from an empirical perspective. Here's a fun thing: scientists use testimony all the time. All the time. Science is built on testimony. It's built on this idea that on the notion, on the mechanism of scientists conducting these experiments and writing papers and writing about their findings and their conclusions, whatever have you, and other scientists take that at face value and build on top of that, presuming obviously the information to be true. There is no one in the world in the scientific community that repeats all of the experiments. And this was actually something I remember that Hamza exposed from the Lawrence Krauss debate, was when I think Krauss was arguing against testimony or something like that, whereas Hamza asked him a basic question: how does Krauss know something? And Krauss mentioned, scientific practice, testimony, whatever have you. Experiments have been done to prove it. And Hamza asked him, have you done the experiments yourself? And he hadn't. He had basically taken somebody else's word for it. So the entire basis of science is also built on this idea of testimony. So if someone has an issue with testimony as a whole, I'm sorry, science is built on testimony as well. Okay? But anyway, from an empirical perspective, yeah, you can only rely on present day information. Everything else is out of bounds because it's not empirical. And also, science, again, one of the facets of it is that it's amoral, which means that it has no moral consideration. So, like it says that science says what is what and not what ought to be. So, if you look at the view and view the world purely from a scientific perspective, it can allow you to conduct yourself in a way that would be morally repulsive. So what was that I think it was called eugenics, I think, where there was this idea back in, I think it was propagated by the Nazis, the idea that everyone should be blonde-haired and blue-eyed and whatever have you. So they would essentially kill off people that didn't conform to the vision that was required. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah for joining. So it basically leads to these kinds of situations where there's been a number of experiments as well done on victims and things like that, where moral considerations were just basically thrown out of the window, and acts of immorality were conducted purely for scientific advancement. So again, science is not the be all and the end all. Okay, that's the point that we need to understand, that even though it's touted as, people are like, oh yes, there's this funny clip actually of Bill Nye somewhere, where he's like, oh, science, yes, science, like I only believe in science. Like, yeah, science is just a methodology, but it's not the source of all truth. It just explains how the natural world works, and that's what we've got to be acutely aware of, how limited it is in its perspective, and therefore how limited it is and how far we should allow its conclusions to go. Does that make sense? There's got to be a fence around it. Now, this notion of science being the only path to truth, which was, I'm not sure it's repeated that much now, but it used to be only a few years ago, which is why I put it in. But there used to be a notion going around. I think actually there was a stream, I think it was about a week or so ago, with Hamza, Sabur, and some others, where they were discussing actually that neo-atheism has now actually died. because it was the neo-atheists that actually used to propagate this a lot, and now this seems to have quietened down. So maybe it is true, neo-atheism has actually died. But anyway, this notion that science is the only path to truth. I mean, let's go to the last point for a second. First of all, it's a self-defeating statement, right? Remember how we covered self-defeating statements? Absolute indisputable proof is the only proof that's acceptable. Well, you can't prove that notion absolutely and indisputably. So again, that's a self-defeating statement. Science is the only path to truth, again, is a self-defeating statement because you cannot prove that principle scientifically. There is no empirical experiment that you can perform that will arbitrarily and will conclusively determine that science is the only way you can get truth. It's because it's not true. So the notion in and of itself is self-defeating. But anyway, the problem is where this comes from is this baseline position that people who have this dogmatic perspective of science, which is what we'll call scientism, they have this dogmatic perspective of naturalism that every single thing has to be naturalistically explained. Okay, that everything that you explain has to have some kind of a natural explanation. And the problem with that is, we'll come to that, right? The problem with that is that it automatically presumes that everything has a natural explanation, and therefore there is no explanation that exists outside of the natural world. And if there is no explanation and nothing that exists outside of the natural world, then by definition atheism is true. Does that make sense? Let me explain that one again, because this is an important point to understand. It's basically question begging, right? If you adopt the position, or if somebody adopts the position that every single thing has to have a naturalistic explanation, then that presumes that there must exist a naturalistic explanation for everything. Right now, as far as Muslims are concerned, everything in nature, yeah, that's fine. We got no problem with that. But our point is that at the end of the day, nature itself has to have some kind of an explanation that's beyond nature. Because nature has to, there has to be some kind of an origin to nature, which by definition is going to be supernatural. But their perspective is no. Nature has to explain itself naturalistically, which is where, the problem falls down. And the problem is, because they believe everything has to have a natural explanation, it means that there is nothing beyond nature. There is no supernatural, and therefore, by definition, atheism is true. So they're coming up with these principles and these ideas that already fit and conform to the worldview that they want for themselves. Does that make sense? That's the problem with this. But then they struggle with the recalcitrant facts, which are things that we know about our reality, that they can't reconcile with this worldview, to which they just basically say, well, we have faith that one day science will work it out. Now, to answer the question, what if they say science is the best method because it works? Science works in a limited capacity. It works in the sense of being able to understand and engage and manipulate and work with the natural world. Absolutely, it works. Oh, but only in that perspective. But what science doesn't teach us is morals. Science hasn't given us a set of morals. Our advancements in science hasn't stopped bloodshed and killing around the world, or corruption, or whatever have you. I mean, look, we're at the most scientifically advanced state we've ever been as human civilization around the world. And look, we're living in most people are living in abject poverty. You have literally a handful of individuals around the world that control practically half the world's wealth, and you have a lot of the people that basically can't afford to feed themselves. We have the resources available, we have the wealth, but it's concentrated literally into a handful of a few individuals. We lack so many things that you would consider part of a progressive society. So again, where is the scientific proof for this? Science can't explain how you should be conducting your finances. Science can't explain, it might give you metrics for, okay, this might work best and that might work best, morals and other things. It has its limited scope. And in terms of explaining what our purpose in life is, science doesn't do that. That's not part of, there's no scientific experiment that you can perform that will explain what our purpose in life should be. The same as on that kettle. There is no scientific experiment that you can perform on that kettle which would explain why the kettle was turned on. So what scientific experiment can you perform on a human being to understand what, why the human being was created? What is your, what's supposed to happen to you? How are you supposed to conduct your lives? How are you supposed to treat other people, whatever have you? Literally, if you want to look at it from a perspective of literally just pure biology and evolution, I suppose. Evolution is predicated, or Darwinian. No, it's just evolution is predicated on this idea that you just got to survive and reproduce, survival of the fittest. So you could argue actually from a strictly scientific perspective that being as taking as an axiom that you want to obviously survive and you want your progeny to survive, that we should actually become a race of ruthless creatures and we should throw morals out of the window, throw altruism out of the window and basically fight for survival. Robbery, thievery, thuggery, and everything like that should be normal place, because at the end of the day, we just care about our own survival. Now you can make, then you'll get some anthropologists who will say that, well, actually no, but studies have concluded that you're more likely to survive if you work together and operate as a society and this, that, and the other, and blah 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 blah. But again, these are at the end of these are conclusions that somebody just draws. It's an opinion. It's not a scientifically validated evidence. It's not something that you can measure. So yeah, science works, but only in a very, very limited scope for a very, very limited thing. But that doesn't mean you use it for everything. Okay, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean you have to hammer everything. Okay, there are other tools that exist, and to be willfully ignorant and blind to it because they're not as fun to use as a hammer, that is not intellectually honest, for want of a better word. And again, we've got it here. Science only passes the truth, negates other forms of knowledge, testimony, logic, beauty, morality, etc., etc. So the point that I'm trying to get at is, so you remember that tree of how we have sources of information, whatever have you. Science is only responsible for a very small aspect of it. Yes, it works, it's proper, and whatever have you, within its limited scope. But again, it can be wrong. Remember the example we discussed yesterday about Albert Einstein. Dr. David says, science doesn't explain anything, it only describes. Is he correct in the assertion? To explain is to give every detail about a phenomenon. I'm going to need a little bit more information about that. But yes, science doesn't. Yeah, okay, fine. So you can say, it doesn't really tell you what. It just describes what's going on. That if when this happens, that will happen. When this happens, that will happen. It won't give you. Okay. Let me tell you something fun that I was looking into. I just came across some videos. I don't know why they randomly turned up, but of Venus flytraps. Okay, of Venus flytraps just eating flies. I was quite amused by it. I find Venus flytraps quite interesting. It's a plant eating animals, basically, for if you want to call flies part of the animal kingdom. But I was looking into how does this inanimate thing, inanimate from the sense that it doesn't have a brain and choose what to do, whatever have you, it's literally just fixed in its position, how does it know when a fly or whatever have you is in its trap? And it does it because there's little hairs there, and when one of the hairs is moved, it starts a countdown timer of about 5 seconds, and if another hair is triggered, then it'll close the trap. But the question is like, well, okay, fine, if a hair is triggered, where is this countdown timer? Because again, there's no brain there. There's what exactly? It's just a bag of chemicals, for want of another description. Where is the brain? Where is this measurement going on? What is the clock that's working out? Okay, this got triggered, and then I'm waiting for another trigger on the same leaf before it then, and then once that happens, then it closes, ridiculously fast, and these other things. It's not understood. It's not understood. At the moment, despite all our scientific advancements, we still, as human species, don't have an answer for how is it doing these basic fundamental things. We have no clue. By the way, also as a side note, it's very rare that you'll also find someone who understands the nuances of what they're actually discussing here. I've had a lot of discussions with, I've lost count of how many atheists, and I've only ever come across one who understood the outcome of what they were saying and ultimately argued. And get this now, he had to argue. Basically the conversation ended with him arguing that he was a snowman. And I mean, literally, he was arguing that he was, when it snows and you actually build a snowman, that he was an actual snowman in the sense that built on the natural world, you just basically, carbon and all different kinds of elements composed in a different matter. And in the same way, you could say, I mean, human beings are what, 70% plus water, in the same way. A snowman is just water, just rearranged in a different matter. You have a little bit of organic material in the carrot for his nose and whatever have you. But the difference being that you see with the snowman, when you build it up, no one would have any issue if you knocked its head off, right? If you destroyed it, of course we would take issue if you harmed another person. But from a purely scientific and from an empirical perspective, because of course science can't measure life, it can only measure the output of it. He had to basically argue for his point to make sense. Kaula, Jazakallah khair for joining us and following. That he was a snowman, that he had to recognize that for him to make his point and for him to win the argument, that he was actually no difference to a snowman. Now, obviously, when you have someone that has to go to that extreme, from my perspective, I've raised that intellectual bar to the point now where he's just admitted that he's no better than the snowman. If he wants to do that to escape the point, that's on him. If that's the level of obtuseness that he wants to be at, that was on him. But it was interesting to know he was the only one that actually understood the implications of what he was asserting. But anyway, have we understood that aspect so far, science and scientism, that what science is and what science isn't? What is the remit of science? How far can science go? And what is the limitation of science? I hope everyone is clued up on that one. Okay, so now in that context, let's have a look at what evolution is. Okay, now pay attention here now. Evolution. Okay, what exactly is evolution? Evolution, first things first, when you're discussing any topic, whatever have you, is best always to define the term. So as we did when we were explaining proof, you want to define it, you want to come to an agreement. It's a good idea to also do that with evolution. Can scientific research be used to infer the existence of God? I absolutely yes. And we will do that in the first session next week, inshallah. I'll actually show you how you can prove God from science. So that will be the first session next week, Saturday at 3 p.m, inshallah. Okay, so evolution. What exactly is evolution? Evolution just means incremental progressive change. That's it. Okay? Incremental progressive change. Now, as a comment, as a definition, do we have a problem with that? Absolutely not. We don't even have it. Because things incrementally change. Our technology changes. Our even our own appearance changes. Even as human beings, as society. Now, for the Muslims of us, we believe that everyone descended from Adam and Eve, and yet when we look around civilization, we see all different races of people. Technically we're all the human race, but you see black people, white people, people of different ethnicities. There's a whole spectrum of people and appearances and whatever have you. That means that by necessity, we have to believe in, even in the context now of biological change, that biological change has happened, because otherwise for us, there's no way to reconcile how everybody shares such different characteristics when we believe everybody descended from the same pair of human beings. Does that make sense? Okay, so just from a definition perspective, we don't have an issue with evolution because lots of things evolve. We don't have an issue with biological evolution either because it's self-evident. We can see it in the diversity of the human race. Okay, so no problem. Now, the issue comes when people use evolution or use the term evolution, and what they're talking about is the spontaneous creation of life. Okay, and that's the problem, that that when people say evolution, they're talking about the spontaneous creation and diversification of all of life that exists through whatever different mechanism that they want, the Darwinian method, or there is actually other different models for evolution that have not been as popularized. But Sabur, mashallah, he's he's done a number of lectures on this. I did try to get him on, and he's got an open invite, but unfortunately he's busy these days. But again, so therein is the difference, that we have to understand, that when someone is using the term evolution, what exactly do they mean by this term evolution? Are they talking about progressive biological change, which we've got no problem with because we see that, or are they talking about literally the spontaneous creation of life, which now that we would have an issue with, because that is a process called abiogenesis, which we as Muslims don't believe in. Obviously, we as Muslims believe that life was created by our creator, and it wasn't a random event that just happened through circumstance. Okay, so where is this idea of evolution coming from? So again, the scientific perspective of life, don't forget, is that we're looking at empirical data. So we're looking at, we have human beings data now, we have data and records of fossil of animals now, we know what the skeletons and things like that are now, and we can see in the fossil record as well what skeletal remains creatures were left behind. Now, what happens then is that we also have evidence of creatures with smaller life cycles, like flies and whatever have you, fruit flies, whatever have you, and we can see that they can change and adapt genetically to changing circumstances. So we also do have examples within a particular species. Now, it's important to note that this is always within a particular species, right? This is not, we don't have an example that we've conducted in a lab or whatever have you, where one species turned into a completely different species. This is always within the same species of animal, but we do have obviously examples of some these micro changes that are happening. So you can call it microevolution or whatever have you. Okay. From then, what the scientists do is, they have these empirical examples. These are their observations, and they have these dots, and they have fossil records, whatever have you, and they try to connect it as short as possible. And the natural conclusion and the explanation is that obviously the life that existed then was a precursor to the way that life is now, and we are basically the result of life then, plus some biological changes and adaptations to society that happened at the time, and that results in us. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so they're literally looking at all of the evidence, and the only and this is the point now, this is, you need to understand this point, which is why evolution is a scientific fact, that they're only looking at obviously the natural stuff. Okay, they're only looking at things from a naturalistic perspective, given the empirical evidence that's been collected already, and trying to come up with a naturalistic explanation for how everything came to be. And the only, let's go back here. The only plausible explanation that appears, from a naturalistic perspective, is that everything biologically evolved, right? So you see where it says natural relationship here in the middle tier. The only thing here is that everything, now we don't understand the mechanism of how that happened, so there are different competing models, Darwinian evolution, Lamarckian evolution, I think it's called, or whatever have you, check out Sabur's lectures for more of those. But we do understand that the only explanation is that there must be some kind of a biological evolution going on here, and therefore, because it's the only explanation, that then means that it's proven, that it must be true. Okay, but it's important to note that it's true, but only when you consider natural observations or natural reasoning. Okay, so it's a scientific fact, yes it is, but only because science only concerns itself with the realm of science. That evolution is the only explanation that you can give that conforms to the natural scientific evidence available and discards any other supernatural influence. Does that make sense? I'm hoping that makes sense, which is why evolution is a scientific fact and is also nonsensical for Dawah to argue against evolution on a scientific basis. I mean, we can point out the flaws and the holes, because there are loads of flaws and holes in it, because obviously there are so many things that it can't explain. So evolution cannot explain the emergence of life. Okay, the evolution just literally cannot explain that. It cannot explain how inorganic matter suddenly became organic, suddenly became sentient, suddenly started to have life, had needs that it needed to consume and excrete, and basically the properties of life. They cannot explain that. And so obviously when you go far back enough, you have, as we discussed yesterday, you have life becoming simpler and simpler and simpler until you get to a biological cell, but you still need to explain where did this come from, and at the moment they just have their faith in it. Actually, on this topic, there is actually a fun video of Dawkins, actually, that I want to show you, which is quite amusing, because obviously they recognize this problem, and obviously Dawkins is one of the big proponents of neo-atheism. He actually has no idea what he's talking about from a philosophical perspective, but so it was funny actually to watch this video. So let me play this video for you. So in this context now, the interviewer is actually asking him to explain the origin of life, to which he admits that that they have no explanation. But rather than to ascribe a supernatural origin, which they would have to do because it's for something beyond nature, he's still stuck within his scientific or naturalistic paradigm that there must be a natural explanation. So have a listen, if you haven't seen this already, as to what his natural explanation actually turns out to be. So is it, where is the video? Oh, there we go. Here's the video. Okay, let's show you this video. I'm going to turn down my volume here so it doesn't come out. Actually, I need to turn this up a little bit. Right, so hopefully you guys can hear this properly though.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. Well, but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. Expelled.
Okay, so let's go back to this. Right. So you see there, what Dawkins is, their perspective. I'm going to come to your question as well, Abu Muhammad, don't worry, or your point. In terms of explaining the origin of life, and not only that, they have no explanation for, how this complicated thing, just the cell. The cell is a ridiculously complicated thing. I mean, we can't reproduce it. We can't make an artificial cell, right? Something that can then split itself and continue to divide and grow, and eventually, from this one single cell, you get an entire organism out of it, right? It's completely beyond our means. They can't even explain how that happened to be through chance. They have to ascribe it to chance because they have no other means. They have no other agent that they can point to that actually said, well, this is where he's trying to introduce an agent now. He's saying, well, it's possible that there must have been, he's recognizing that it's likely that there was some external influence. That, come on, look, the chance of this happen, the likelihood of all of this coming together through complete chance on its own is so remote that we need to look at some kind of an external influence, yet still they want to ascribe it to some kind of a naturalistic external influence, which now is an alien from another civilization that just came to Earth and seeded DNA here, and we're basically our planet is essentially just a giant petri dish for another civilization. But again, and what he recognized is you still would need to have an explanation of where that civilization come from. So he hasn't actually resolved the problem of the origin of life or anything like that. He's just basically moved the goalpost a little bit further past, and he's happy with that because, oh well, that's scientifically fine and sound and whatever have you. He's just gonna stick with it. So you see how ridiculous it starts to become, that when you narrow your perspective to only look at this one thing. So first thing I want you guys to understand is why evolution is a scientific fact, and it's an undisputable scientific fact. Because the issue is not the fact that it's scientific fact. What I want you guys to recognize that what the limitation of science is and how they got to it being a fact, because they only considered a narrow set of information. That doesn't necessarily mean it correlates with reality. Okay, and that therein is the point, because there are a lot of things that it cannot explain. Now, Abu Muhammad, you mentioned evolution said abiogenesis is not part of evolution, and technically that's correct, because evolution is to deal with the biological change, whereas the question of how did life even begin from inorganic matter in the first place, how did chemistry turn into biology, is a separate issue. I put the two together because when you're talking to someone, at the end of the day, I'm not here to teach you about science. I'm not here to teach you about evolution. The whole point of this course is for you to be able to discuss with people who you might be discussing with, who might use evolution as a counter explanation for, why does there need to be a God, or whatever have you. And from their perspective, when they use the term evolution, they use it as a wide blanket to cover anything and everything in this regard. So I'm just using it from that perspective, that there's, as you can just call it from a scientific perspective. As a scientific perspective, it doesn't carry weight in any real sense. It only carries it's only a singular explanation when you take a narrow set of circumstances into account. Does that make sense? Okay, why can't ID explain the current data? Intelligent design. So ID, intelligent design. Why can't intelligence design explain the current data? Because you have to explain, and this is what the whole point of that video was, you have to explain who is the designer. And the problem is, from a naturalistic explanation, that where they get trapped is, well, if you're positing that there's an intelligent designer, or designer, you have to now then explain the material nature of that designer, including the origin of that designer. And here's the point, obviously from our perspective, ultimately everything comes from the divine reality, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is uncreated. So to explain Allah in a naturalistic sense and then the origin of Allah, it makes no sense. But again, this is the problem. When you narrow your perspective down to just looking at things from a naturalistic perspective, from a scientific perspective, you're necessarily going to come to the wrong conclusion because you've blinkered yourself, which is why we went over those things in the earlier slides. Life cannot exist without information. Information is part of intelligence design, right? So, excuse me. So, also a bunch of recalcitrant facts as well that we've listed here on the slide, which is that, so I've already discussed this, how chemistry turned into biology, best case aliens did it. Okay, so I've got the video there. The Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is basically an instance where, when you have a look at the fossil record, you see all different kinds of life emerging at pretty much the exact same time. Hence, it's the explosion of life. Whereas if all of life was a series of from gradual change, you would see evidence of that taking place over a long period of time, rather than being compressed into a single position. So it's almost the evidence pretty much points to life essentially almost being spontaneously coming into existence, or it all existed at this one particular point in time. We also have no example of genetic mutations where information is increased. So what does this mean? Where you have something that started off very, very simple, and then it turned into a more complex thing. Okay, so obviously life that exists right now is human beings, whereas complex as it comes, we have the ability to think and whatever have you. But we have no example anywhere of where anything that started off as something simple actually turned itself even over time or whatever have you, into something more complex and more intricate. It's just literally not there, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Actually, it's at odds with morality and compassion, eugenics. So again, if evolution, based on survival of the fittest or whatever have you, because that's essentially what it is, that the traits that survive get reproduced, whatever have you, it would actually lead necessarily to an existence where essentially all life was competing against itself just to survive, which is completely at odds with the moralities and things that we as human beings, the compassion that we feel for others, that the help that we get, we're readily going to help other people, whatever have you. The sick, for example, sick people, sick elderly people, right? From a purely biological, naturalistic explanation, they should just be killed off because they're a drain on society. But we as human beings with compassion, with ethics, with morals, we don't do that. We build hospitals and, we'll try and treat them and make them as comfortable, regardless of, whether they might be a drain on society or not. But we value life. And those kinds of notions are not products of evolution. They have no evolutionary weight, that there's no reason that this would have evolved for survival and reproduction from an evolutionary perspective. You can reverse justify it now and say, oh, well, it's good for society, but you have to think back at the time. Well, how would that have evolved in the first place? Because it would have to have grown so slowly that it wouldn't make sense in the first place. Okay, and also, here's the other thing: we as human beings, we are a unique creature as well, in that we have language. In the beginning of Surah Rahman, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches man how to speak. We are the only creature that can speak, that can build society, that we can educate ourselves. Here's one thing that human beings do that nobody else does, no other creatures do. We have schools. We can, our society can progress and improve itself based on what the previous generations had learned. Whereas if you have a look at all of the creatures, they're literally doing and acting the same thing as every other generation before them. They have no ability to learn anything new and then pass that on to future generations. Fine, you might have a scientist now who will come and say, oh, I saw a monkey using a tool once. Yeah, okay, fine. Let's see that monkey now teach its offspring how to use the tool, and for the offspring to then improve on that tool and start making other tools and, start engineering. It's not going to happen. Monkeys, they've literally got their own limited cap. Whereas again, human beings, we are completely distinct and unique, and there's no evolutionary explanation for why that would be the case. Okay, now the bottom point here that I've got here, it doesn't negate a creator. If anything, it reinforces his knowledge of creation. So this is my personal take on it, right? Rather than using evolution to prove or disprove the necessity of God, I actually prefer to use evolution from the perspective of proving the nature and the divine wisdom and knowledge of the creator. Okay, now this is a little bit of, I don't think, not many people are actually making this point, right? So this is probably going to be something new. So just try and think with me for a second. So see the point there, which is that there's no example of genetic mutation where you increase information in the genome, right? So you start off with something simple, and then from that you get something complex. Okay, so we have no example of where you have something that's simple and you have something complex. Okay, If we accept the theory of everything as scientific fact, then do we have to accept Adam alayhi salam had ancestor, since one of the definitions of evolution is that a common descendant with modification, in other words, a species can turn into another species which is acceptable by evolution. Why do we have to accept this theory of everything as, right, wait, hold on a second. Why? Oh, the theory of evolution. Right, okay, sorry. Because there's also the theory of everything as well, which refers to creation. Okay, sorry. If you accept the theory of, that would make more sense obviously in context. If we accept the theory of evolution as scientific fact, then do we accept Adam alayhi salam had ancestor, since the definition of evolution is that, right, okay, wait. Okay, so this is where, again, I need to be clear. Okay? We accept evolution as scientific fact because from a scientific perspective, okay, let me make this very clear. From a scientific, naturalistic perspective, when you just have a look at empirical data, at all the empirical data that we have, and you try and connect the dots and explain how everything came to be, evolution is the only explanation that has any chance of making any sense, and therefore, because it's the only explanation, it is a scientific fact. Okay? And there's some point. It's a scientific fact. That doesn't mean that in terms of the actual reality, that that's actually what happened. Okay? So we can accept it as a scientific fact from a scientific paradigm that yes, you can. It's considered a fact in this sense that evolution happened, because you will only accept it as that's the only explanation science will afford you. However, we as Muslims believe that there are other alternative explanations which involve a supernatural origin, which have a higher explanatory power, that contradict the scientific narrative, and we give affirmation to that over and above the scientific narrative. Okay, so maybe it's probably better to explain it that way, that we'll accept that, yeah, this is the scientific narrative, and that as far as you're concerned, it's a fact. And by the rules and whatever have you that you've come up with, it's a fact, right? It's a fact in that sense. But we don't take that fact, that perspective that you're projecting as an accurate reflection on reality, because we take a more holistic approach, that there is also supernatural explanations possible, because at the end of the day, nature has to explain, it has to have an origin that was beyond nature in the first place, unless we're claiming it's eternal, which we can't. That therefore, if you take that into account, there are other explanations. For example, we have miracles and things like that, which we'll come to in the future. We have other explanations that provide a better, more coherent explanation as to where life and originated from, and we give higher credence to those. Does that make sense? So just because we accept evolution as scientific fact doesn't mean that we have to accept, Adam alayhi salam had an ancestor. Okay? Jazakallah khairun, Yamin. I don't know how to say that. Yamin? Jazakallah khairun for joining. Hey, how's it going? So I hope that makes sense. Okay, there's a very, very important distinction there that we need to understand. Had an ancestor, since the definition of evolution is common descendants. By the way, that wasn't the definition of evolution that we described. That there's a common descendant with modification. We just said evolution. We defined it as progressive change. This is evolution now. Darwinian evolution or whatever have you. Am I a Muslim? I am indeed. Should be interesting. Yes, I am. So I hope that makes sense now, or makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure how else to explain it otherwise. Okay, but don't just think that just because something is proven scientifically, particularly when it involves something that's beyond the boundaries of science, that necessarily has to correlate with reality. Scientific facts can and do correlate with reality when it involves things that are purely naturalistic. Is it a scientific fact that water boils at 100 degrees C at normal atmospheric pressure? Absolutely. And that's a completely natural world thing where, the scientific fact here correlates with, real world. But scientific fact with regards to, evolution, whatever have you, that no, it doesn't necessarily correlate because it's looking at things from a naturalistic perspective. No, I don't speak Arabic. Sorry. So the my take on evolution, inshallah, is that imagine. Okay, so let me give you the example of the mobile phone. Okay, imagine you had a mobile phone that was able to was such, so we all have mobile phones, right? And we've probably had mobile phones for a long time. How to use the evolution to prove the existence of God? No, I don't use evolution to prove the existence of God. Rather, I use evolution to demonstrate the majesty of creation. Like, this is how Muslims should be looking at evolution. That look, I am perfect as a Muslim. I am perfectly happy to believe, because this is an actual scientific fact that, you know, I'm happy to believe correlates with reality, that from a single cell you can have an entire organism being created. Okay, or even from two cells. So you have the egg, and you have which is a single cell, and you have the sperm cell, and the combination of the two will then grow into an entire human being. Does that make sense? Okay, so perfectly happy with that because we know this is the nature of reality. Absolutely no problems with that. My point here is that when you consider the complexity involved, that within those original cells, those original two cells, you can answer his question. Which question would that be? Who is his? That within those original two cells, you would basically have the blueprint and the mechanism for that cell to be able to divide and self-create and basically create duplicates of itself, which would also divide and self-create and whatever have you. And then for all of these cells to then take on specialist functions. You know, some will become skin, some will become blood, some will become bone, some will become nerve, and whatever have you, that they take on their own individual specialist functions, and they arrange themselves in such a way that you start to have a much more complex organism resulting from the whole. Okay, right, go ahead. Yeah, you can do that. Does that make sense? And the point being that for it to do that, that information needed to have been in the cells in the first place. So, for example, use a mobile phone example. Imagine that we had an example of a phone. Imagine if I gave you a phone and I said, listen, right, you know, because we there was a point in time where we used to replace our phones every year because new features were coming out. And then that's probably slowed down right now because, you know, we've got everything that we can probably think of inside of our phones. But imagine if I was to give you a phone and I was going to say, you know, let's go back in time, right? Let's go back in time. And I was going to give you a phone and I was going to say, hey, listen, see this mobile phone that you have, right? The more that you use it, the better it's going to become. Like, the software is going to learn all about you, like learn what kind of things you want to do, and it's going to start changing and adapting to what you want. The screen is going to get bigger. It's going to, you know, it's going to recognize that new features are required, and it's just going to basically embed them in itself. It's going to, if you drop it and it falls and it cracks, you know, it's going to be able to repair itself and whatever have you. You would not think, you know, if I gave you a phone like that, no rational person would think, wow, this is just a basic phone and it's just, you know, in and of itself just learning how to do these complex things. You would think, oh my god, that is the ability for this mobile phone to self-improve itself. That is amazing. Because look, in our history of things, we've never ever come across anything or manufactured anything that can improve itself. Everything decays. That's just the nature of how things are. Things just decay over time. You know, there's an actual argument for God in this, which is based on I forgot the term now. I forgot the term. Anyway, forget. It's to do with all the particle movements and stuff. But anyway, things decay, right? I've got empiricism stuck in my head. It's not empiricism. It's anyway. Right. Anyway, that if you actually had this phone, you would surely believe that whoever created this phone in the first place must have been some kind of a genius. Must have been amazing to have created a device that just goes ahead and can make copies of itself, and every single time it makes a copy, it's making a better copy. It's just improving, it's just observing and responding to the world around it, and just basically improving whatever have you. And even on some fundamental level, you've got to realize that for the phone to be able to do that on some basic level, the ability for it to do that, all of that programming and whatever have you, had to be in the phone in the first place, which means that very first phone that you've got given which originated from somewhere, was some kind of an amazing creation, and whoever created this must have been some kind, I mean, to say genius would be an understatement. Does that make sense? So now you've got to think of, like, let's have a look at evolution in and of itself. Like we're talking about a biological cell that has the ability to split itself, cut itself in half, be able to replicate itself and to grow, and to basically allow for a far more bigger complex organism to emerge just from that one cell in the first place. Like, surely all of that information had to be in the cell in the first place, which means that the actual creation of the cell is in and of itself as close to a miracle, if not a miracle, as you can get. That in and of itself shows the sophistication and the intelligence of the origin of that cell, to be able to put all of that ability and functionality inside something so small that it can then just manifest into something greater. Does that make sense? Okay. So the Quran actually explained how human fetus grow, even though that was 1400 years ago. Human beings did not have the tools to accurately describe this, but the Quran did. Actually, okay, in this, human beings did. Different civilizations actually did. So there has actually been, Hamza did a paper on this, Hamza did a booklet on this, and there are actually evidences and things from other civilizations where they had the information, which is why that paper actually is not published anymore. This is the whole approach of using the scientific miracles for the Quran is a very fallacious approach, which is why, if you were not here for the earlier sessions, which is why I spent a long time talking about it, but we'll come to those in the first place. But yeah, don't use that. Other civilizations did have the information. That's not to say that it wasn't a miracle that it's in the Quran, because all of that information wasn't concentrated into a single person or a source or an author. And again, even those civilizations that had information, they also had incorrect information as well, which the Quran doesn't have. So you do have this question being raised of how is it that all of the correct information was concentrated, in this case, in a single individual, without any incorrect stuff. So that is a point that you can bring up, but I wouldn't go around tooting this, because that's not going to end. That's not going to be a fruitful discussion in my opinion and experience, inshallah. So I mean, just to go on this. Okay, base POV. I don't know what that is. Okay, okay. So I mean, just to reinforce the point. I mean, look, this is the evolution of mobile phones, right? You have a look at the old mobile phones, how they used to be, and how they've actually evolved over stages, right? And let's just say let's just say life on Earth died out, right? So you had, Transformers, imagine that they were real, and they came to Earth and they just found all these mobile phones, and they found, we found an iPhone 6, we found the older iPhone 5. You can see how long ago it was that I created these slides. That, what are we on now, iPhone 12 or something like that? That this is what, six years ago that I created these slides. And anyway, go with it. That they start talking about, look, there's we've seen older, more basic things. Now, obviously, it would be natural for the Transformers, again, themselves robotic, to presume that, these phones must have just evolved by themselves. And someone will come along and say, well, no, how'd you get from an iPhone 5 to a 6? There's a big jump there. There must be. And then someone else will pull out, well, actually, no, they were intermediary phones and whatever have you. And then they'll say, no, you'll have some of the people say, no, how can you explain that? And then the Transformers will pull out, but look, there's, we have all of this information. I mean, from their perspective, you can understand why they would believe, we're talking about a civilization now who is metallic and obviously, whatever you want to call it. I was going to say organic, but they're not, they're metallic, right? But what I'm trying to get at is to put you in the mindset that you could see why they would conclude that these things would have evolved, because that's what would have happened within their society from their paradigm. Obviously, they're not real. This is hypothetical, right? But it's the same thing for us as well, that when you just look at things with a narrow perspective, only from a naturalistic perspective, that yes, you can understand why, from a science perspective alone, evolution is fact, because it's the only explanation. But that doesn't mean that it conforms to reality, because they don't take all of the facts of reality into account, and therefore the conclusion they've come to is only limited to that limited perspective, which is why I said it's a scientific fact. It's not an absolute fact. Does that make sense? There's a difference between saying a scientific fact and an absolute fact. Okay, that's really the takeaway here. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense. So now the final slide here of points to understand. Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a very, very powerful instrument used for coming to conclusions, okay? Which is basically that oh, by the way, before I move on to that, let me show you, because actually after I started arguing this, some brothers actually made a video on this. So let me show you that video as well, before I forget. Here we go.
Hello, my name's iPhone 6 Plus. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in fairy tales that some creature with intelligence created me. Let's just say I don't have to believe in it. I'm just a product of chance. You see, I'm made of metals and plastic. I have lithium battery made of some materials like zinc, cadmium, nickel, and others. I've DDR3 RAM built of millions of microtransistors and capacitors, all arranged in chips. 5 central and graphic processing units, which consist of silicon and other semiconductors, flash memory, sapphire screen, and many other components. All these elements just formed into each other through decades of evolution and selection. We know our origin and predecessors. We can actually see their remains and traces everywhere. Their evolution story is perfectly sound. And here we are, iPhones. So why in hell would I need stories about myths that made me with their hands? Are you kidding me? You know what? I don't believe in jobs. Yes, I might find it reasonable that Mr. 2007 version believed it. He did not have other options. But come on! That was in 2007. The man didn't even have GPS, for crying out loud. You can't blame the guy. But do not come to me in 2015 and tell me that we should think the same way. Because I think if we did that, then we don't deserve to be called smartphones anymore, do we?
Okay, so basically, you know, it's just a fun cartoon illustrating the same point that, you know, that it depends on how you connect the dots, that you can just connect the dots and just assume that chance was the driving factor here. Actually, I think I did mention, I don't think I addressed it, but I think it was mentioned on one of the slides actually, that chance is not a here we go. Evolution is powered by, right, so here's a problem. Evolution is powered by a natural process, right? That random events are driven by environmental pressure, but that can't actually drive anything, you know. So things are not driven by chance, because chance is just the output, the result of things. Actually, do you know what? I think that's a little bit complicated. Let's leave that for another time when I've got a better example for it. Anyway, right. Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the simplest explanation with the greatest explanatory power is generally considered as fulfilling the criteria of proof. Okay, what does that mean? Basically, the shortest distance between 2 points is the straight line. Like, the most obvious explanation is likely to be the truth. Okay, is the most likely to be the truth, to the point where the simplest explanation is, you know, overwhelmingly supposed to be regarded as the acceptable truth, as opposed to an explanation that requires more input or more reasoning behind it. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So So yeah, and also the simplest explanation doesn't require an explanation, otherwise you get an infinite regress, because you have to explain. It's like a child asking why. You'll never, if you have to keep explaining things, you'll never get to some kind of a conclusion. That you have to have some kind of an explanation that the reasonable person should be able to use their rational faculties of thought and agree actually is a satisfactory explanation. Now, what's the last point? It prevents intelligent discussion of the tooth fairy, pixies, leprechauns, but allows God. Because here's how you put Occam's razor into practice. So sometimes you'll have people that will say, well, if you believe in God, you might as well believe in pixies and tooth fairies and whatever have you, and all these magical supernatural creatures, because from their perspective, they're all one and the same. But here's the difference. There is absolutely no basis to believe in the tooth fairy or pixies or leprechauns or anything like that, because there is no evidence for them. There is no explanation. There is no explanatory gap that we have, that we experience, that requires for the tooth fairy to be an explanation. Does that make sense? We don't have a crisis right now in humanity where we need to basically resolve a question and the only potential answers for it is leprechauns or tooth fairies or whatever have you. Okay, so tooth fairies and all of these creatures, they don't even get their foot in the door because they're not required as an explanation anywhere. But God, we do have a question, that affects the whole of humanity, of where did we ultimately originate from? Where did reality come from? What is our purpose? There is a question there that requires an explanation. Okay, and ultimately that explanation can only come from something that was higher. We'll cover this obviously in the next week, but this is where God comes in, because God, or the concept of a creator, a divine reality, does provide an explanation as to where reality came from, where we came from, what our purpose in life is, etc., etc., etc. So that's why you cannot include, or for atheists that throw the concept of creator out with all of these other things, that they actually haven't understood what they're doing properly. And this is unfortunately a big problem, that you'll find a lot of the biggest champions of neo-atheism or whatever have you actually don't understand basic philosophy at all, that they just basically have these stupid little slogans and ideas that they champion, but they don't understand the depth, and they like to pretend that they're the ones who are thinking, and they're the thinkers and they're the intelligent ones, and anyone else who believes otherwise is not. Unfortunately, we don't do ourselves a good service in that, because a lot of the proponents of the Dawah are also not very academically sound, and we don't give ourselves a credible basis either. But anyway, the point there being that there is the principle of the simplest explanation being closest to the truth is a standard methodology for arriving at truth, and it also allows you to include discussions of a creator, but also exclude fantastical fantasy, fairy tale possibilities. Okay, hope that makes sense. Now, pay attention to logical fallacies that some people will bring to you in the discussions. Okay, so there's a couple here which is appeals to emotion. So when some people will say things to you, right? So really, when you want to be having your discussion, remember the whole thing about argumentation. We want to be talking about things that we can actually, when we can actually measure. Let's go back to that the argumentation slide here, which is here, right? That the premises must be they must be self-evident, intrinsically evident. They must be plausibly true, and whatnot. You need to have some kind of way to test these, right? You can't build an argument, and you shouldn't allow anyone else to build an argument based on emotional appeal on its own. So some people, like to argue against God because, my parent, my family member was a good person all their life and nothing good ever happened to them, and blah blah blah, and they just get all emotional. Oh, if I believed in your ideology, then I'll have to believe that this beloved person to me who's already passed away is going to spend eternity in punishment and torment or whatever have you. That's not an argument. That's just you're appealing to emotion. And yeah, emotions are difficult to get to resolve. We spent the entire first weekend discussing that, but that's not a basis of coming to truth. Your emotional perspective, that your emotions don't necessarily lead you to an objective truth. They'll just lead you to a subjective truth. Like your emotions will lead you to who you love the most, right? They're not going to explain to you, or they're not going to lead you to who is loved the most in the world, so to speak. Does that make sense? Okay. Black and white. So this is also another fallacy that people come up with. It's like it's only this option or that option. There can be that in situations where the options, you can have a black and white situation, right? We'll come to those examples next week, right? But it's important to note, Jazakallah khairan, Saint Just Germany, for joining in. Welcome. You can have that, but in also other cases, you can also have more than the other option. So, this idea of you're with us or against us, no, you can be an abstain, you can be a third party. You can have a completely different perspective altogether. You can have something nuanced. Hi, how's it going? Thanks for jumping in. Okay. Appealing to authority. So this is something like, Dawkins says this about God, or whatever have you. First of all, he's a scientific personality, and even then, now I understand from Sabur, so again, this is testimony, but I trust his reading and his research. He knows what he's talking about. That even among academic scientific circles, Richard Dawkins is literally just regarded as a commentator. He just writes articles and things like that. That he actually has no scientific community standing in and of himself. So again, appealing to people like him, saying, "Oh, his perspective is X, Y, or Z," that doesn't necessarily lead to truth. Even the idea, the notion of just appealing to scientists, their perspective on God, because again, if they're talking from purely a scientific paradigm, they're talking from a paradigm that in and of itself already automatically believes that nature is, well, not that nature is all that exists, but doesn't even consider anything outside of nature. Does that make sense? Thank you. Ambiguity, again, so misrepresenting language to make your point through obscurity. So again, this is like when someone is talking about evolution as well, we need to discuss exactly what do they mean, what do we mean by evolution, because if somebody asks me, what do I mean by, do I believe in evolution? I can't answer that yes or no. I have to understand, what do you mean? Do I accept that there is evolution and progressive changes in things? Yes. Do I accept that happens in biology? Yes. Do I accept that some species have developed new characteristics and things like that? Yeah, I'm happy to believe that. Do I believe that all of life originated from the exact same origin? No. Do I believe that life spontaneously self-created? Absolutely not. So you have to understand what's being said as a blanket term and exactly what do you mean. Okay, and correlation doesn't equal causation. So just because you have a fossil record or whatever have you that suggests one thing, doesn't mean that thing was necessarily caused by that. Actually, there was some fun, I need to put some fun graphs here. There was a fun graph of the uptake of the downtake of Internet Explorer, or the usage of Internet Explorer, correlated with some kind of a murder graph as well going on in America. So just because the two correlated, you can't come up and make an argument that, okay, yeah, once people stopped using Internet Explorer, murders started to go down. Like, just because things correlate doesn't mean that there's a causational value there as well. Okay, so you have to understand these things, and these are just a few of the logical fallacies. As we mentioned, there's several that you can go through on different websites. Okay, theory versus reality. Okay, so again, another thing that we have to understand is what is theoretical, so what could happen in theory, which is completely different as to what could happen in reality. I mean, there's practical examples of this, when it comes to evolution as well. Some scientists are trying to discover, how is it possible that the cell could be, proteins could be created spontaneously through a mixture of, right circumstances, and yet, in theory it's possible, but they've yet to be able to recreate it. There's a different thing. There's a question here about mathematicians and engineers. So here's a question. Here's a question for you. So consider you have a mathemat. Wait, actually, how do I explain this? How should I explain this? You have two people in a room, right? This was a joke, but I'm just going to explain it because I'm getting a little bit tired now. you have two people, a mathematician and an engineer, and they have to reach a target on the other side of the room, and a prize. And the first one to reach the prize wins. Now, the rule is that they can only go half of the remaining distance. Okay? Half of the remaining distance. So it means that one person makes a move, so he'll go half of the way towards the prize. Then the other person will make a move and he will go half of the distance that remains, and whoever reaches first will claim the prize. Okay? The mathematician gives up straight away. He gives up straight away because he realizes he's going to lose. Whereas, the engineer, he's all for it, and he goes for it, and, because he knows that he has a chance of winning. What's the difference between the two? The difference between the two is that the mathematician is purely looking at it from a numerical perspective, right? And he knows that whatever number you take, right, whatever the distance is, if you keep halving it, right, you will never, ever, ever get to zero, which means he will never reach the prize, and therefore he will never be able to claim it. Okay, because if you keep halving the number, there's always going to be, the number will just get increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller, but it'll never be zero. And that's the mathematician's point, which is why he gives up straight away. Whereas from the engineer's perspective, and that's theory, right? Whereas the reality, the engineers, they work in reality, they'll actually build a system. And he realizes that all he needs to do is to be able to get close enough that that small distance doesn't matter anyway. You might as well consider it zero. And therein is an important difference, that reality is not necessarily the same as theory. So there's this thing with regards to creation. There's this, which is often mentioned, that, if you had 1 million monkeys typing on 1 million typewriters or whatever have you, you'll eventually produce the works of Shakespeare. Okay? Or an infinite amount of monkeys on an infinite typewriters, you'll eventually produce the works of Shakespeare. Which, if you look at it from a completely random perspective, yeah, because the idea is that if you have enough random smashings going on a keyboard, that eventually one of them will be random enough that the works of Shakespeare will be the product of that random chance. That's the idea. Okay? And from a purely mathematical perspective, that's true, but here's the point. It doesn't take into account specified probability. And what is specified probability? Specified probability is the notion that you take into account that when you're mashing your hands on a keyboard, there are certain keys that you are more likely to hit than other keys. So you're going to more likely hit A, S, D, and keys in the middle row than you are the other keys, right? And you're going to repeat certain patterns over and over again. To be able to type in a word or a sentence, you've got to be very specific to type here, there, 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 there. And that kind of pattern of events doesn't happen through random mashing that a monkey would do, So even though mathematically, if you gave every single letter, every single key on the keyboard an equal chance, yes, mathematically at some point there'll be some, one chance there that, yeah, it could come out. But whether it happens in reality, particularly given that the fact that when you're mashing on the keyboard, you don't, not every key has that same chance, that will result in a completely different outcome, whereas you could argue it would never happen. In reality, it would actually never happen. So therein is the difference. And the last point is, something that you should consider mentioning to the person that you're talking to. This is an appeal to knowledge here, is that when facts have been discovered, when facts are known, when the truth has been exposed, they should change your worldview. That it would be intellectually dishonest to allow your worldview to reinterpret the facts to suit yourselves. Okay? So, that being that, I hope, one other point I've got here, actually, theory versus reality. We can make a fault-free book. Yeah, okay, fine. In theory, it's possible to write a book that's completely free of errors and defects. In reality, try it. It's not going to happen because human beings are just inherently fallible. So, that is the end of this section, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for listening. If we can have some time for some questions if you guys have any. Otherwise, we will conclude. And I'll put this up on YouTube, and the link to the notes will be there as well. And inshallah, next week we're going to be discussing the argument for the divine reality, for how can we demonstrate through argumentation, through logical proofs, through scientific proofs, whatever have you, that the only rational possible explanation for our reality is a creator. Okay, so I'm not a sheikh. I'm just I'm a student myself, man. It's just something that I've spent a lot of time learning, and I just want to propagate. So yeah, any questions, or should we call it there? No? Cool. Other wiki articles you find interesting are map territory relation and principle of sufficient reason. Okay, I'm going to have a look at those. What are the building blocks of reality in my view? Are you talking about this new particle that's been discovered? I don't know. And here's the point that I will give you as a takeaway message. I don't care. You know, when discussing a lot of these things, and what I find is Dawah spend a lot of time discussing matters that ultimately, if it's not going to change the fundamental basis of your belief or how you engage in your life, why stress about it? Does that make sense? Okay, so I don't understand the question then, bro. Do you wanna rephrase the question? So I assume you're not talking about the boson particle and stuff like that. What are the building blocks of reality in my view? I don't understand what that means then otherwise. Yeah, okay. Any other questions aside from this, or once we've answered this, then we can call it a day. Like, what is it that constitutes our reality? I don't understand what you mean by that, bro. What constitutes our reality? Okay, as in what constitutes? Okay, if it's the question I think you're asking, like how would we define our reality? This is actually the very first question that we're going to be discussing on the slides next week. Okay, so if you come back at 3 o'clock on Saturday next week, could it be matter? Could it be mind? Could it be a creator? Well, our reality is, you know, from our position, it's physical, that we can interact with it, engage with it, but it doesn't mean it's only physical, right? You can also argue that our reality is also transient because it exists right now, but we also believe that there will come a point where it doesn't exist, at least not in this state. So it is a transient thing. There was a point in time when our reality did not exist. When I say point in time, there was a point when our reality did not exist. It exists now, and there will come another point when it doesn't exist again. It depends on how do you want to classify it. It's a completely subjective question. It comes down to the rules of classification. Again, the same thing with evolution being a scientific fact. It comes down to the rules of classification. Like, how are you going to measure that? But again, I'm still going to stick to my same answer, in that if it doesn't change the way that you live your life, or what you believe is going to happen in the hereafter, what you believe about your creator or whatnot, if it's not going to change any of that, what difference does the answer make? I think we as a community, we spend way too much time fixated on things that ultimately have absolutely no bearing on the way that we live our lives, and we need to stop doing that. So with that, let's call it a day, and I will see you guys next week, inshallah. Jazakallahu khairan for your attentive listening. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. And also, please do, share the khair, let other people know about the stream, because next week now we're going to be building on these principles to put forth a coherent argument for the Creator that, it's completely watertight, airtight, it's completely robust, inshallah. So I'll see you guys then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.